Good evening and welcome to the May 8th, 2025 Oregon Public Defense Commission Work Group. I see there are a number of commissioners here. That's wonderful. We have a pretty broad agenda, and the agenda is really just to, per usual, open discussion on items. There's a couple of really broad-based discussion points, and we'll start out with the executive director giving us kind of an introduction and cue up the conversation. But before we do that, I just wanted to address for people who are watching, for providers who are watching, and I know Director Sanchagrin can talk about this a little bit more in detail, but the commission is aware of, and we are working through the issues with the indemnification clause and the addendum to the contracts for the current cycle and upcoming cycle. That is something that the agency is internally working on and will address shortly with providers. So just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we did know about that issue and that staff is working on it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Director Sanchagrin, which I'm going to say that on one. I want to say it in 2 words is the problem. So sorry about that.
I've heard many variations over the years, so I'm pretty immune to it now. I assume you can hear me. Okay, I had a microphone issue earlier today, so I was worried that would rear its ugly head again this evening. So it's good to see everybody online tonight. Yes, I'd be happy to kind of tee up a few things that we're hoping to discuss this evening. But first, I just wanted to provide a little bit of basic background on what we've been working on. In now, I guess this is my 3rd week at the agency, coming up to a close there. And so just a very brief director's update. Most of what I've been focusing on over these first couple of weeks is trying to get to know key staff internally and to learn more about our internal processes. So I've been very inside focused. Excuse me. I have had some meetings with legislators, but I've also begun a little bit more of that outward work as well. So we had our first meeting with one of the presiding judges, Judge Guptill from Washington County this week, and we're picking up with that external discussions heading into next week. And also had some good meetings with the directors of nonprofits within our crisis counties earlier in the week and got some really good feedback from them. And I'm also happy to mention that I'm no longer the newest person at OPDC. We also brought in Steve Arndt, who I know was introduced to you by our previous director, at least in one of her updates back in April. But he is our new trial support and development manager, and he's really hitting the ground running. I think that he is going to be an incredible addition to the agency, and just super excited to have him on board. The next item I wanted to just discuss very briefly, attached to the materials that you received today, was the letter from the governor that was sent to me upon my appointment. I think it motivates some of the discussions that we'd like to have tonight. If you have taken the moment to read the letter, it's relatively simple and straightforward, but I think that 3 topics or 3 statements within it really jumped out at me that are really motivating the work that I'm doing now that I'm here at the commission. And the first is that, the letter really focuses on that statutory duty that we have both within, or the constitutional duty as a state, but then statutory duty we have as a commission to provide representation to all Oregonians, and the fact that right now the system is falling short in those endeavors. And it does acknowledge that this is a crisis that was created, it's been created over time, and it's the responsibility of all system partners to address, but it does also have a real focus on us. And she stated that, it was her expectation that we as a commission will lead and make tangible process quickly in reducing the number of unrepresented folks that we have within our state here. But then also that all ties into, I think, what we're hoping to start having some discussions about tonight is that third, and I think it's what's most on the minds of folks, whether you've seen it in the media or from looking at the letter itself, but that is the charge that I have to provide a timeline to the governor by June 1st as to when we believe the unrepresented crisis will be resolved. And I think that it's important to emphasize there that a lot of folks have talked about specifying a date, but the actual wording in the letter is a timeline. And so I think the expectations are much more around, if there are certain levers that we can pull or certain levers that have already been pulled in previous meetings, then we need to try to figure how that will impact the crisis and what that would look like as far as being able to address it moving forward. So to that end, I've had a lot of meetings. I feel bad for taking up so much of Chair Nash's time and Vice Chair Mandenberg's time. We've been having a lot of meetings throughout the last few weeks, both to get to know each other, but then also to discuss ideas that are floating around out there, many of which are not necessarily that new, but that could begin to form a framework that we could utilize going forward to try to demonstrate how the commission is trying to address the crisis. And so when I talk about a framework, I think at this point it's really just been ideas, bouncing ideas off each other. For a lot of it's me been getting a lot of history on what's been tried, what hasn't been tried, what may work, what may not work. But just to give a quick rundown of some of the topics that we have been discussing, I think the first one I'll mention is what the chair mentioned at the outset, which is trying to find a way, right? Well, it all ties in with Exhibit F. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but the first one that we've been talking about is doing an extension of our pre-existing contracts to try to allow us as a commission to move into the 25-27 contracting period on firmer footing and firmer footing that we need because there is such an uncertain budget and statutory environment right now, given what's going on in the legislature. There's a lot of internal work that has been going into making sure that we can incorporate the changes that were voted on by the commission back in April, but then also an opportunity for us to have some of these discussions about any other potential changes we might want to make as we go into the next 2-year funding cycle. So that was the first one. We began to work internally on how to actually operationalize and make sure that we can do that from a contracting perspective. But then in addition to that, we've been talking about, it's been talked about a lot, but whether there are opportunities for further flexibility within the MAC model that we're currently utilizing. And that could range anywhere from trying to shore up some language around the 15% variance that we already have within the contracts to make that a little bit less onerous on folks, to maybe something that moves beyond that threshold and provides additional flexibility. We've also been talking at a very broad level about incorporating data into our different processes, and that could be from everything to try to tell a better story about the good work that's being done in public defense to a whole range of things to try to make sure that we are actually measuring the things that we need to communicate to the legislature going forward. We've also been discussing the evolving role of the state trial division and the services that they provide and how they can be leveraged to further address the crisis. And then the roles that staff can or should play in local jurisdictions, whether as assignment coordinators or the role that staff can play in greater contract compliance and oversight. And so I didn't want to steal the chair's thunder so that she can control which, kind of what order we take those in or whether we take them up at all. But that's at least a report on some of the items that we've been talking about over the past few weeks. I'm excited to hear more feedback and thoughts from you as commissioners.
Thank you. And no one is surprised by any of those items. Those are things that the commission's been talking about for a while. And now that we've had kind of a broad overview and broad discussion about those, particularly at the June meeting, staff is now having a more, the beginnings of a more granular discussion about, all right, if we do these things, how can we implement them? And are they things that we want to implement? Because as we've learned, when you push on one lever, something else, it affects, it's not a single thing, something else is affected. So trying to just make sure that we have that, that we're using our imaginations about what might work and also what won't work if we do the wrong thing. So with that, I wanted to have some discussions just about those topics and any other topics we could think about in terms of how we want to frame the discussion or the letter to the governor in terms of a timeline. And I will say over the last, I've shared this with the vice chair and executive director over the last week or so, particularly since Lisa Taylor, I got Lisa Taylor's email with the unrepresented report on Friday. I know it was sent out to you this week. And I really started thinking about her numbers and that report, which I found to be very helpful over the weekend and through the week. And what really kind of stood out to me is that case filings are up and we're holding our own generally. So it's true that the unrepresented out of custody numbers are creeping up a little bit in places, but they're not creeping up at the same level that the case filings are going up, which tells me that the current workforce, at least for now, is capable of managing the current workload. What we don't have the ability to do is manage the backlog because there aren't enough lawyers to manage the backlog. So what kinds of, so really I started thinking about this in two different ways. What do we need to manage the caseload now going forward? And what do we need from partners, particularly the legislature, I think, to be able to manage that backlog? What kinds of programs can we put in place? What kinds of, I guess it's not fair to say just the legislature because it's system partners too, obviously. What resolution dockets, developing criteria for dismissals, maybe something, who can we reach out to? Who can we talk to? What kinds of things can we think about how to deal with the backlog? So that's really, at least the way I've been thinking about it. Again, this is just in my head over the last few days, and I really want to have a more broad discussion about all of your thoughts about how we want to move forward and how we want to frame our response to the governor. I'll just kind of open that up for anyone to ask questions, to give suggestions to. All right, I was hoping you would say something, Peter. I could see you nodding your head, so go for it.
Well, I really appreciate how this has been framed. And the numbers that Lisa sent out on Friday really were startling to me. And not only the increase in case filings in Washington County, but in Multnomah County, 28 cases were dismissed on the eve or the day of a trial, which used up 220 hours of public defense time. We really need to have conversations, and I don't know if the executive director can respond if he's having conversations. We need to be having conversations with our systems partners to say, what can you do? And we talked previously about mandatory settlement conferences. Does that require the legislature to insist that the crisis counties do mandatory settlement conferences? What can we actually do to change the dynamic here? Because I'm afraid we're not going to be able to send the governor a letter by June 1st to say, oh, we're going to get this solved in any period of time unless there's systems changes. Increasing the number of public defenders, of course, but also how are we going to change the systems in Multnomah, Washington, Jackson, and other crisis counties?
So OCDLA had a bill that didn't advance in the legislature with system efficiency suggestions, and that might be a really good place to start looking at that. I remember it had discovery requirements about timely discovery. And, there's been some pretty big cases that have been dismissed, including one in my county recently, a criminal case where in the middle of trial, the court granted a dismissal with prejudice because the DA had not provided exculpatory information to the defense on an attempted murder case. Yeah. And, those kinds of things shouldn't be happening. And the DA's office said, well, we didn't know it existed either, but whatever, that case went to trial on a Measure 11 attempted murder and was dismissed with prejudice because of prosecutorial misconduct. And, those, whatever system efficiencies that can be put in place to deal with discovery, to deal with settlement conferences, I think that's great. And I'm not sure we have to reinvent the wheel because OCDLA has convened work groups and had those suggestions, which didn't move forward. And they wanted the legislature to do that, but some of those things can be done by Chief Justice order. And so, we could certainly talk with the Chief Justice about putting some of those things in place. I mean, I don't know if she would be willing to make settlement conferences mandatory, but maybe she could strongly suggest them. or some wording to be able, I mean, the thing about when you set court dates and when you set mandatory substantive hearings like that is it forces everyone to open their file and look at their case.
Correct.
And so it's just a way to manage the bad actors, unfortunately, sometimes. But you know, if that's what we need to do to move cases along, then that's what we need to do to move cases along. So I think that's an excellent idea. What do other people think about looking at those kinds of issues? Paul?
The biggest thing that occurs to me, well, two things really. One, there is a lot of wasted time in court. And it would be, from my perspective anyway, easy to make judicial changes and prosecutorial changes so that everybody wasn't showing up at the same early hour and waiting an hour or two for their time to speak for 5 or 10 minutes and get their case set over. That happens all the time. And it's going on. I happen to be in Deschutes County Circuit Court last week with a young gentleman who had a disorderly conduct. He was homeless at the time. And we were there for a half hour just to learn that the case was going to be set over. And there had been no communication between the DA's office and the defense office. And that was after 4 weeks of supposed preparation. There is a lot of wasted court time. It would be beneficial to the courts as well as to the defense and the prosecution to cut down on all of that. The other thing is, I think there's some resources within the general overall system, not just the defense system, but the system in general, to provide some relief. Judges, when they retire, get an option to, which almost everybody takes, to do some pro bono work for the judiciary. There's no reason why that couldn't be extended to retiring judges who have been prosecutors or defendants in the past, who would be rather spend their time in their home county dealing with criminal cases on either the prosecution or the defense, or sitting in a judicial tribunal doing settlement conferences and just moving cases. The system has a lot of advantages, I think, that aren't really being taken advantage of as yet.
I want to be clear about what you're suggesting. You're saying that Plan B judges could do Plan B prosecution or Plan B defense work.
Defense work is what I was talking about.
Okay.
The prosecutors have plenty of resources at this point.
So okay, that's a very interesting idea. Well, thank you. I like that. Rob.
But the big idea I have is we've got to convene judges, district attorneys, and defense lawyers, get them all in the same room, get them talking to each other and say, what can we do to save money, not just for the defense industry, but for all three partners, the courts, the prosecutors, and the defense. All could have enormous savings if we just scheduled better.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. We've all, our practicing lawyers, had our fair share of sitting there. It's gotten better after COVID, I will say, in some counties. I mean, I'll tell you, in Benton County, all of our criminal and all of our status conferences in all cases are remote. And it runs a lot faster. So it's true, I'm sitting at my desk, but I'm not sitting at my desk with my client's appearing from where my client is. I'm appearing from where I am. The jail people appear from the jail, or their lawyers go to the jail and appear with them, but they appear from the jail. And it is way faster than all of us sitting in a room together. There are some, I mean, at least if you're in the same room, you have a chance to talk to each other. So there are inefficiencies about that, but it does move faster. I mean, I used to spend like whole mornings in court, and now I'm spending, 30 minutes. So that's a thought too. Rob?
Thanks. I agree with that. That's actually, most of that stuff has been an issue for many, 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 many years, sitting around having these mass dockets instead of docketing individual cases, which that's what leads to sitting around for 2 hours, waiting for your PV to be resolved. Those are local, and I've gone to the local rules, the UTCR committee made presentations, and judges come up to me from various counties and they just say, I'm going to do what I want to do. It's my county, it's my court. And not all of them, but a fair amount. And so, or that won't work in my county, or that's not the way we do it in my county. And they're the ones that control the docket. So it really does have to come from the chief. And the efficiencies need to come from the chief. Because my experience, and I think Jennifer's as well, is that you can make some progress, particularly in these crisis counties. Maybe the chief can make some specific rules for court procedures in the crisis counties only, if that's lessens the pushback, possibly. And so if we focus on these crisis counties, maybe we don't, maybe under the emergency rules or whatever, we can make some progress with some of these efficiencies you've all been talking about. And we won't have to potentially alienate judges from, 28 other counties, or not alienate them, but, it may be easier to deal with. Secondly, on the settlement conferences, one of the things with settlement conferences, they should be mandatory if requested by a party, I believe. You can usually get them in our county, at least. Most of the counties I practiced in, you can get them in the more serious cases. You're not going to maybe get them in a shoplifting case unless there's a mental health problem. But the issue with these, and we've talked about this, where if you do a settlement conference and the DA just becomes what you feel is unreasonable, maybe even the judge feels it's an unreasonable position for the DA to be taking, right? So under the statute, any party who participated in the settlement agreement can not request, has the right to say, my settlement judge is not going to do my sentencing. Take it out. Don't do that. The judge can hang on to the case if the defendant if they can say, nope, this is our settlement / sentencing if we get there, right? And it gets assigned to the judge, because who's objecting to that settlement judge doing the sentencing. It's the DA, right? Because the defense already has the right to say, no, we're not going to plead guilty today, right?
So you're saying if the defendant waives, then waives the conflict with the trial judge. In other words, the waiver should lie with the defendant, not the state.
Yep, the state has no right to object to that, because what will happen in that case is you can plead to the sheet in that case, knowing what this judge is going to do, and the DA cannot stop you from doing that. If you did that, the defendant doesn't come out scot-free. They still got to plead everything, so it's not like there's a huge advantage there. But I've seen it where I think it's a reasonable resolution to a case. The judge thinks it's a reasonable resolution to get a case, but you have a DA who doesn't. Well, maybe in these crisis counties, at least, we can resolve these cases, at least some of them, particularly some of the more difficult ones, if we change that rule. It has to be by statute. That's not a court rule. Those are two suggestions: having the Chief Justice intervene with some efficiency rules in the crisis counties, and eliminating the DA's veto on settlement judge being sentencing judge.
Thank you, Susan. You're muted.
One of the things I like about Paul's approach is that we all know that this is a systemic problem. It's a system problem. And it can't be resolved by just one part of the system. It'll take everybody. And I know we've talked before, and Peter has talked a lot about it being we can look at it as an economic supply-demand kind of problem. I think that what I like about Paul's suggestion is that we need to find a way to make changing things attractive to all the players in the system. they have to have an incentive to want to work on this. Right now, they don't seem to have an incentive because they can duck out of having to take any responsibility by blaming us and blaming defense attorneys. And I'm not sure we can get rid of them wanting to blame us. And so I think the other side of that is the way to approach it is to make it in their self-interest to want to do something different. So efficiencies for the court, I've never been a prosecutor, so I don't know whether they feel that there are inefficiencies that are frustrating for them, but certainly talking to some of them might be able to reveal places where they feel that they could benefit from more efficiency. I heard, and I can't remember, Jennifer, maybe you're the one who mentioned it, but I heard somebody mention that some legislator had raised the issue of insufficient prison capacity and had the idea of giving prosecutors in at least some counties a limit on how many people they could send to prison at any particular time. In other words, tying tying
That's
tying charging decisions to or plea bargaining decisions to how much capacity there was in the system to support the number of people they wanted to send to prisons. And this isn't something we would want to suggest out the gate because I think it would make a lot of people angry. But I wonder if at some point there's some way to talk about a prosecutor's efficient use of indigent defense resources and make the connection in people's minds between prosecutorial behavior and the supply available to service that behavior. I'm not sure how we could do that, but I think that connection has to be made somehow at some point, in addition to providing incentives to want to be more efficient. I don't think the kinds of changes in efficiency that we've been talking about, although extremely welcome, in and of themselves will solve the backlog problem. Settlement conferences might, special courts might, if they are used correctly, but if they're just performative, they won't.
No, I think you're right about that. And I think these are more going forward, managing the workload going forward discussions. And what you're saying reminded me of something that I've been thinking about that I talked with Ken about, and that is, we've heard from Lane County about how Lane County diverts, my word, not legal word, a lot of their cases out of the criminal justice system by charging violations. And I really want to know what the data looks like regarding public safety, because we heard this astonishing number of violations that they file, and there's a really, their charging decisions and their decisions are born out of a shortage in the DA's office. So they have to manage the prosecution workload as well as the defense workload because they don't have enough prosecutors. So as we heard, so they're spending a lot of time charging violations. So I'd be curious to know, because I think it could be very helpful to this discussion, what the impact on public safety has been. Now, of course, we know they're understaffed with the sheriff's department, maybe I don't know, maybe the police department as well. And that, of course, maybe their jail, and that, of course, would have some impact too. But I think we could use that data to talk about how you don't have to charge everyone to maintain public safety. You can charge, you can get people in front of a judge and fine them and still maintain public safety. or community service or whatever they're doing with their violations. And we can ask the presiding judge about that. He'll tell us what he's doing. So that I think dovetails kind of into what Susan was saying. Is a little bit different, but related. And that is looking at the kind of the public safety issues from a broader perspective. And then making decisions about how cases progress based on data that we have about public safety. Rob? Oh, you're muted.
Jennifer, you and I have talked about your idea on that a
Yeah.
while ago. And I think that, I agree that'd be a great, maybe a medium to longer term project, because the DAs that I talked to said decriminalization and dismissal is not on the table. Forget it. That's it. You could get them in a room and talk to them all you want. And that's been their position, unless like Lane County, they don't have the resources, which also displays one of the issues that we have, that our defense lawyers have, which is our defense lawyers don't have the power to reduce to violations. They don't have the power not to charge. They don't have the power to dismiss. They can't come and say, oh, I don't have a docket availability for 6 months, get in line, right? Or if they do, they don't. We're sort of doing that without giving them a lawyer, but it's not like you get a lawyer and you wait 6 months. You don't have a lawyer. We have the least amount of power in this system, yet during this situation where there's a crisis, we're the one that's expected to do everything to fix it. DAs say we're not doing a lot. Some judges, some courts don't. A lot of judges actually been very cooperative. The one thing for the short term, for the governor's response to the governors, the only thing that we've ever done, honestly, that I think has worked, I'm not going to say it worked well, I'll say it worked, was what we've referred to in the past as the wingspan docket. Which I don't know if Commissioner Lipscomb was around or is aware of that, but basically it's if you're unrepresented, come to the court. Basically, there'll be several lawyers there. They'll go over the cases. The DAs are supposed to have super duper offers, such as reduced to violation for misdemeanors, and we can cure some of this backlog. We did this in Washington County 3 separate times. I helped put that together. And that's why they call it Wingspan, because it was usually at the Wingspan conference during COVID. It works pretty good. Most of the clients pretty much like it a lot. You have to have really experienced attorneys, DAs who are willing to do it, and judges who are willing to do it. Those are the kind of conversations I think you could have in the crisis counties. Say, how are we going to put this together that works? And that's something that has worked in the past, Ken, and could work. It has to have resources available, which I don't know. I don't know if the agency has the dollars. I think we took it out
Trial
of
division.
what's that?
Trial
Oh,
division.
trial division could do it. Good point. Send a couple of lawyers from the various trial divisions, and it's a little time. It's not hard to put together, coordinate everything. Because there's a template for it now, and several counties have done this. That is
Jackson's
something.
working on it.
Jackson is. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that could actually, if we can hold our own, like you say, and then you have the trial division people or the local people if they have time, the hourly consortia attorneys who are taking a 0.7 caseload, for instance, who maybe have some time. I think that's the short-term way to hit this issue and get the numbers down.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The other thing that I know there isn't, well, I'll table my comments for later. Peter?
I was going to echo what Rob was saying, and I think if we can frame this even like as a 4-year pilot project or whatever it might need to be, particularly for the crisis counties. Again, I really like the idea that's been expressed earlier to not impose new rules on counties that aren't in crisis. But if we can frame these things saying, you're a crisis county, we need you to do this for 4 years to get the backlog down. We're not trying to take away the power from anybody. I do like the idea of incentives. If we can provide incentives, we don't have the power to do that, but the legislature does. But again, to use that framework of saying, for the crisis counties, we need to do this for the next 4 years to get the numbers back down to where they need to be.
I am worried, very worried that I think the writing is on the wall that that FIP is going away, which we all thought it needed to go away because the idea was it was going to be paired with an hourly rate increase. I don't think that's going to happen now. So I think, I mean, it's very, the budget is so uncertain right now, as we all know, for the federal situation is who knows what's going to happen. Also, we have the next revenue forecast comes out, I think May 18th. Yeah, 14th. And that is going to, who knows? I mean, we can guess what it's going to look like. And then we're going to be in a world of hurt because we're not going to be looking at how do we maintain things. It's going to be how are we cutting things. So, and it'll be everybody. So that, and we've had, you know, those of us old timers, we've had experience doing that before. You know, we may be seeing those bad old days again of the BRAC days, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But I am worried that we're going to lose the ability to attract private bar lawyers who have been the people who have been able to help us maintain the caseload, and especially the in custody folks. That when we lose them, we're going to have forced releases, and we're going to have the unrepresented list is going to grow, but maybe we can. So this was part of my thought about the short term, long term. You know, if we put together a short term plan that included some hourly, bringing in private bar hourly lawyers to clear the backlog of cases, maybe we could get some infusion for one-time backlog money, not ongoing program money, wouldn't be part of CSL, wouldn't be, you know, but it's like fixed, you know, hire these people in, well, not hire them, but, you know, hourly lawyers in, get the cases cleared, etc. So that would absolutely have to be a part of the short-term plan and not the long-term plan. The longer-term plan for the workforce is bringing in, you know, more lawyers into the trial division, etc. So one of the things that we haven't talked about that we really haven't talked about as a commission before either, that I want to talk about this evening, is contract modifications regarding caseloads. So we've all heard lots of people suggest that it would be nice if we could get lawyers under contract to take more cases. There have been some more serious discussions about that from various players in the criminal justice system. And I want to have a discussion about the pros and cons of that from a philosophical level, and also just what we can identify as logistical hurdles and any concerns that we have from commissioners about having lawyers take more cases than what we are having them take now. So as you may recall, our contracts have 100% maximum, which is maximum attorney capacity. It's 300 weighted misdemeanors. And by weighted misdemeanors, it means that there is an internal weighting system, and felonies are weighted more than misdemeanors. Major felonies are weighted more than minor felonies, etc. But the measure is, generally speaking, 300 weighted misdemeanors. We did adopt different caseload standards that reduce that caseload. We are not going to receive funding to sustain that. So the idea has been floated. Oh, so sorry. There is also a deviance in the contract that says that it may be that a contractor would not be out of compliance if they were under that 100%. So if they were 85 to 100%, or 100% to 115%. And so you could imagine, understandably, contractors are not going to sign up for taking more cases, A, if they're not going to be compensated, and B, do we want to have them take more cases and compensate them? Those are important philosophical questions that I think we really need to talk about, and we really need to make some decisions. Well, we can't make decisions today. We can just have discussions and then we'll make decisions later, but we need to have some discussions about that, and what we think about that. So I want to open that up for discussion. Rob, why don't you start?
Yeah, so
Rob first and then Tom.
couple things. I want to make it clear, and I'm sure Jennifer probably managed her contract loads like this as well, and our consortium members. I always looked at the deviation of what 15% to be a month to month, quarter to quarter thing. So, someone got loaded up one month, even if they took a little too many or too little, the agency wouldn't give me any problems. But by the end of the 2-year period, I wanted to land around the 300. So some lawyers would cut off and didn't have to take any cases the last, month or something, because I knew they'd still take cases that came back that were prior clients. So, but anyway, I wanted to land about that number. So I don't know that there's any lawyers taking consistently 345 MAC every year without being paid for it, to be clear.
Yeah.
And so most lawyers, I think, should end up landing around the 300, particularly on the low-level felony misdemeanor type cases, if that's their case line. Yeah, they should be paid if they're willing to take more than the contract number of 300 MAC under some conditions, in my opinion. The lawyer should have a minimum experience level of 5 to 10 years of experience. They should be doing not 0.1 MAC, but they should have a level of experience that allows them to do a higher caseload, because in essence what you're doing by doing that is you're increasing their hourly rate. Just like a lawyer with more experience gets paid more per hour because they can be more efficient. A brand new lawyer might be charging $250 an hour for a family law case because they struggle to learn stuff, but a good lawyer like Jennifer might be charging $350, $400, $425 an hour, and she's worth it because she's efficient, she's effective. Now, in the same way, you're not charging more per hour as an experienced criminal defense lawyer, but because you are able to be more efficient with that misdemeanor CFL case, you're able to take another case. Instead of taking 12 hours, it takes you 9 hours, whatever the thing is. And so by paying more to take more cases, you're effectively rewarding a lawyer who is able to continue to deliver quality service just to a few more cases. So I am absolutely 100% fine. I would limit it maybe to 15% over MAC, and I would have sideboards on it to make sure that that lawyer is experienced. I don't know what the number is, 5 years, 10 years, 6.5 years, 7 years and 4 months. I don't know what it is, but it's something. And that way you wouldn't have a brand new lawyer being totally overwhelmed just because they wanted a bigger paycheck, right? Which is what we're trying to avoid. Is it a perfect way to do it? No, probably not. But it is a way, at least in the short term, to address this unrepresented crisis and get the cases well represented, because you're going to have the more experienced attorneys taking these cases.
Tom?
I was going to say some of the things that Rob said. I think the sense I have from the various partners we have in the criminal justice system is we can't avoid raising the maximum. Just as a thought experiment, I was trying to think of how that could be done. It's certainly not my preference. As you know, I've not favored that until I started thinking about it recently, but it seems that we're being a little paternalistic in assuming no lawyer could exceed the maximum. And as Rob points out, there are, probably some people among us who are that good and that familiar with what a case takes. And it seems to me you'd need at least 2 elements to experiment with a higher maximum. One would be, as Rob says, a pretty good system on the front end of verifying credentials. And then another element I don't think we presently have would be some way of monitoring, whether lawyers are being sloppy or perfunctory. And I'm not sure what that would look like, whether we might have staff or, seek the help of courts or, survey client. I just don't know how we might do quality control. But, it's true that the ethical protection, that requires competent lawyering, that requires conflict-free and zealous lawyering, it doesn't yield when you have more cases. I mean, there have been times in my career when I've taken on more responsibilities and done it. It was unpleasant. I shouldn't do it over a long period, but I think Rob makes a good point too about sort of smoothing long term. And if we have these rigid limits, for short-term periods, um, that might not be good considering that some lawyers may do a bunch in a certain period and the back off. So I just don't think we can get around increasing the maximums, at least for
And-
subpopulation.
And do we generally agree that it should be in crisis counties only? So crisis counties are across the board, allowing lawyers to take more cases. I think probably crisis counties, right? Because that's where we're trying to solve the problem. Yeah, all right. Susan?
There we go. So I share Tom's concern about there needing to be some way for the commission to monitor. I think it's difficult. We don't have the kind of sophisticated data collection capability that we hope to have within the next 3 years. We don't have it now. But there may be some ways. I know I've talked about this to some people. There may be some ways to use the data that the court systems can provide to us. For example, we may be able to find out when lawyers appear to argue motions, or how many when they appear for settlement conferences, or whatever. And there may be some very simple questions that we can ask lawyers who want to take overages to provide. For example, tell us how often they met with their clients. That shouldn't be hard for people to keep track of and provide as information. So there may be some simple ways that we can achieve some oversight, especially if these things are limited to the crisis counties. But the other thing I wouldn't want to see is having this availability be turned into pressure on lawyers who meet the criteria to take more cases. Because I know that right now, many in the system who aren't defense attorneys and are not on the commission see MAC as a requirement. And if contractors are not operating at 100% MAC at whatever time the data are sampled, they're being accused of engaging in a work stoppage. If we're going to allow lawyers to take 15% over, however much over, I don't want that turned into a requirement that lawyers do that. And if we're going to be monitoring, I don't want that to be turned into something that can be used against the defense attorneys who are doing this work. Because we need good people to stay in the system, and we need them to be able to judge for themselves what they can and can't do.
Rob?
You're muted.
Yeah. To Susan's concerns, people shouldn't have to take more than the MAC. And I don't know that hopefully there wouldn't be any pressure to that, but I think we have to be very clear. It's not a requirement. Number two, for some reason, Many defense lawyers don't want to keep that data. They don't want to keep time. They see it as an impediment. I agree they should, by the way. I agree that we could come up with some criteria, maybe for people who want to opt into the overage. That this is part of the requirement. It will be a barrier. You'll probably see some people saying, I'm not going to do it if I have to do that. So I think we should have a light as foot as possible that meets our needs. Also, and I think I wish I would have pulled the data up earlier, but a lot of the crises in the lower level misdemeanor CFL cases, the MAC, because of the volume of cases, the MAC is a pretty fair. It isn't fair. It's way too high. Fair means realistic number of hours that lawyers have to spend on that many cases because it averages out. MAC is not such a good measure for lawyers who are taking very serious cases with high weighted values, because some of those may go to trial. If you have 5 murders, you know, if 3 of them go to trial versus none of them go to trial that year, you know, that's really a sort of a real big variation between those lawyers. I would really like to see the agency look more at an open caseload model for the more serious caseloads, because I think it's a more accurate indicator of the work that you have to do on your desk during the year. That being said, the crisis is mainly, from what I understand, in the lower level cases. So adding the 15% is a pretty good way to deal with that. I don't necessarily think it's necessary to do it for the lawyers that are taking the serious cases. I think that should probably be more of a workload model, or I hate to use workload because I ask people what that means and they don't know. Open caseload model, right? Which modified by the county's process that affects your open cases. There's a way to do it. So I agree with Susan, should be mandatory. If we're going to have reporting, in my opinion, it should be pretty light so we don't put up barriers to people wanting to do this. And I think that could help address also the more immediate answers that the governor is requesting from us.
Peter?
One issue that hasn't been brought up is one that came out in testimony in the Medford meeting that we had recently, and that's the access to to clients. And again, looking at the crisis counties, if there's a way that we could require the crisis counties to ensure access to clients within a 48-hour period or whatever's reasonable, because again, that's a systems problem that I understand here in Jackson County. Our jail is overcrowded. Many jails are overcrowded around the state, but we have to find the way to do that. And you know, whether that's, you know, is it putting people in vans and taking them over to the Human Services building to have meetings there, or what's the process to have that required that the attorney has access to their clients within a reasonable period of time? Is it 48 hours? I'm not sure what it is, but I think that has to be on the list.
Well, you know, I never wanted to talk to my clients on video back in the day because there was no private place for the clients. But I don't know why they couldn't just find a private place with the computer. Now you're not going to have a conversation about where did you bury the body if there's a body on video, but you know, you can have a conversation about, hey, I just want to let you know when your next court date is. I want to let you know what's going on in your case, you know, something that is more benign, but you want to make contact with your client. Seems to me like that ought to be relatively easy and may help. I had thoughts that are about timekeeping. Well, let's not call it that. Monitoring quality that are directly related to what we've been talking about. And I'm interested in other people's thoughts. I had kind of with the idea of the lighter touch, 3 things that I think might be really helpful if we were able to measure for people who wanted to take more cases. And that is the time that you spend with your client, the time you spend waiting, because I think we need to capture that. Are you waiting a court? Are you waiting to see your client? Are you, you know, what are you waiting for? And then, and by meeting with your client, I also mean meeting with family members, things like that. And then reviewing discovery or other information that you receive on the case. Because those are really good measures of quality, right? How often are you meeting with your client, and what are you reviewing in preparation for your meetings with your client or going to court? And that seems like a pretty minimal amount of timekeeping or data collection. And I would hope that, especially because if lawyers know, hey, you're capturing how much time is being wasted, they might be eager to provide us that information so that we can start to measure it. And I think that would be really helpful. And if we limited it only to the lawyers that want to take those other cases, as a pilot project, for lack of a better way to put it, I think that might help. I'm wondering what people think about that. And, is that workable? And do you think those are the right things to measure? Rob?
Yeah, I think those are good measurements, because if you're not going to measure like 12 different things, those are some pretty good things to be measuring. How often are you communicating with your client? And the waiting thing is a data point. I will say, to be fair, the history of the agency is not good at developing that sort of a thing. And so from a short-term standpoint, it may be if we impose that sort of a plan right off the bat, it may impede the crisis county's ability to go over the 300 and for those lawyers to get paid for it. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. Maybe you say when this becomes available, you will be expected to do it. Because, do we use spreadsheets? Do you just take a piece of paper and write it down for each file? On the inside of each file, you've got something, but some people only have electronic files, or mainly electronic files. So I agree with that, but I think maybe we should say when it's available, you'll be having to use this, just so we don't put up more barriers.
Yeah, so the PCRP program has, I think there's 5, I don't know, something like that, categories of time on a spreadsheet that the agency provides, and it's already pre-done, and you just fill in the information, and then it gets sent back once a month. And so that's really, kind of what I was thinking about, is that, they're already used to providing data under the contract for the monthly reports. So it would just be additional data that would be provided for people who are taking these cases. That was my thought anyway. But that's an operations thing, and we're not operations, so Paul.
Yeah, I recognize that I'm the newbie here, and there's more that I don't know than that I do know. And I don't know for sure where the low-hanging fruit is, but I'm sure that there is some low-hanging fruit. And my suspicion, and that's all it is a suspicion, that the low-hanging fruit in terms of saving money is on the low-end cases, where people are not likely to be going to jail. And what the client really wants is an expedited resolution. Typically, they want this over and done with. They don't want to miss work any more often than they have to. They just want to get it over. And the system gets in the way of accommodating that desire. And I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I will say that, and I don't know the exact percentage, and maybe Ken knows off the top of his head, but an astonishing number of these cases on the unrepresented list are non-diversion eligible DUI cases. It's the single biggest group of cases, and those cases, as we know, can't be negotiated by statute. So they're either going to try, or they're going to get dismissed because they're not ready to be tried. So that was my other thought, is, I don't know, can we do a rocket trial docket or something? For people who just want to come in and pick up some DUIs and try them, or can we set up, is there a way to set up alternative DUI docket in counties? I don't know, but or maybe not. Maybe those cases those are the cases that have to progress the usual way with attorneys. But there's a large number of cases that are those DUI. But you're right about the low-hanging cases. I wonder if, that was my other thought, is can we ask someone, and that we have to identify who, to come up with criteria for those low cases, like non-person, misdemeanor, non-victim, whatever, non-restitution cases. Can those be, they sit there for 3 months, and if you don't commit another crime, they're dismissed. Whatever. I mean, I just made that up right now. But can you come up, can we come up with some dismissal criteria, some deferred adjudication, you pay $150 fine, whatever, do 8 hours of community service, whatever. But can we start to think about that? And nobody's been willing to do that. And I know that, or nobody has the ability to do it. Nobody stepped into that space. And maybe we just need to do that. And if people say, okay, no, I'm not willing to do that, then fine. DAs in Multnomah County or Washington, whatever, say, no, we're not going to do that, fine. But we've put the framework in place. We've made the suggestions. We've looked at the criteria. We've done our part, and maybe other people like the governor's office or OJD or whoever can or their legislators can put some pressure on them to take a good hard look at that based on the framework we've developed, or give your own input, system partner, DA's office, whoever. Or can we work with ODAA directly? Can we sit down with the Amanda Dalton, the lobbyist from ODAA, and try to say, I know you don't want to do this, but if you were forced to do it, what are you willing to do? I mean, I don't know. Nobody's tried to have that conversation, I don't think. So I think that we do need to start looking at that too. Susan.
On that topic, something that you said the other day when we were meeting at our weekly meeting with Ken, which I thought was an interesting observation, and that was that people charged with misdemeanors who've been out and on the unrepresented list for a significant period of time and have not committed any new crimes might be viewed as though they were on probation for that period of time, and therefore would be eligible for one of these more expeditious resolutions. A change in viewing these people as criminals who haven't been tried, to viewing them as citizens who've shown by their pseudo probation that they can be dealt with without having to go to trial, go to jail, etc. So I like that comparison, that observation. I think that's a useful way to think about people.
I think that's great. I think that's great.
Well, and I mean, we don't have to solve all of it, right? We just have to put together a framework for discussion and identify who might be the people that we want to bring to the table to try to work on these things, for a plan to the governor. I mean, we don't have to come up with all the answers, but I do think if we say, develop a framework for, develop the data for a framework to analyze cases on the unrepresented list for alternative disposition or dismissal, or we could just say alternative dispositions, which could include violations, right? Do some community service, pay a fine, be done with it. Straight sentences. Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, I think that I remember that conversation you and I had maybe a month ago, similar to this, that you developed that as well. And I thought that was really smart. And what Susan just said, like basically these people are on bench probation because if they violate it by committing new offenses or, having contact or whatever, a contact violation, they'd be pulled back in and arrested. So we're pretty sure that, in fact, that might even be a little bit more than bench probation, frankly. Some of the close street supervision and some of the other things are probably doing in Multnomah County. But, for sure, if you tied that in with a wingspan type process, where the judge recognized, well, you've served 8 months of bench probation, so I'm going to give you 4 months bench probation and pay this fine, and you're done. That's a realistic sanction that would be equivalent to what would have happened if they got a lawyer when they first went in. So the DAs are not giving anything up. The judges are not giving anything up there. And we could work that in as part of the wingspan program. Might have to be by statute, I don't know, or at least maybe just develop a framework of this is what we would see happening or how it would work. Because you are going to get pushback from DAs. Like I've said, we're not dismissing, we're not reducing. It's our job. We were elected to do this. We weren't, no one can tell us what to do. We're elected officers. The other thing we could do as part of the quicker docket resolution program, in addition to this, giving them credit for their probation that they've served, is to try and get some funding for the DA's office in the courts. It does take personnel to do this. And I would also make a lot of this specific to the crisis counties. Again, it's going to be an easier lift if everything is specific to these crisis counties. It also could be an encouragement for the DAs to get them out of crisis as well, if they don't want to have these programs not shoved down their throat, but not imposed. Well, sort of imposed, I guess, if you do it this way. So I think putting this together in some way and incorporating a lot of these ideas into a packet for the short-term stuff. Long-term, I've always told our DA, I never saw wingspan as a long-term solution. We're not going to do it again because I really did not want the DA to think, or the judges to think that's just going to be our out. But at this point, I think it does reduce the backlog. I will tell you, it just does. If done correctly, the clients appreciate it. As Paul pointed out earlier, some folks do want to resolve the cases. They do want to pay their due and they're ready to move on. Doesn't release the lawyer of the obligation of doing enough investigation and consultation with the client to make sure that even if the client thinks they want to plead guilty, they actually do have a good case. And we need to explore these things with them each time. So the program, if put together and incorporated with a lot of ideas we're talking about now, could reduce the backlog within a period of time. I don't know what the period of time would be, Ken. For purposes, it would take a little more calculation and thinking about that. But I think that if they're really interested, if the powers that be are really interested in reducing the backlog, this needs to be done well enough to protect their rights, to make sure that they're given credit for the work they did. Let's see if they can get earned, like you say, maybe not earned dismissal because you're going to get pushback. Maybe some days will be fine with it, but at least make it an option of they've earned the right to get a diversion or have it divert or earned dismissal, earned reduction, earned whatever it is. And that might be the way to package this to make it more palatable to some folks who I know are going to oppose any kind of what they're going to see as decriminalization, which I don't see it that way. I see it as someone who's earned the right to avoid involvement in the justice system going forward and have a not be impeded by a mistake.
No, I just pulled up the while you were talking, the OJD unrepresented. This is the public facing on the, you can get more granular data. The agency has more granular data, but the out of custody unrepresented pretrial is 2,643 misdemeanors, 1,095 Class C felonies, 198 B felonies, 28 Class A felonies, and 1 murder. And remember, and then there's some contempts. And out of custody doesn't mean walking the street necessarily. It means out of custody on the charged case. So like the murder case, that could be someone who's out of state, who's on a parole hold, or who's at the state hospital, well, they'd be in custody, but they could be in custody on another case and just out of custody on the charged case. but that's by case. And so that just kind of gives you a breakdown that absolutely most of these cases are misdemeanor cases that we need, and low-level felonies. And in fact, nearly all of them are. And then there are there's warrants and a bunch of those. I don't know if those include the warrant cases or not. That's a separate category. But anyway, just as just a little bit of information. Sorry, Peter.
So I was just gonna just support everything that Rob was just talking about, and again, just really say that we should focus on the crisis counties. We should put a time limit on it. It can be a 4-year program, and see how much progress we can make in 4 years. And I'd like to generously offer Rob and Susan to meet with Ken to develop this plan further, because I do think they have the expertise to actually try to flesh this out. So that's my generous offer for tonight before I sign off because I have to feed my family.
Sounds good. Thank you. There's actually a working document that's already been circulating. So I think that we can just fill it in. And this will, the commission meeting materials, the goal is to have them out 10 days before the meeting. I imagine that the framework for a plan would not be included in those because that we're talking about like tomorrow or Monday. So maybe not, but it might be a little bit later. But I do, this is something that we're going to have to take some action on, at least the broad framework during our next commission meeting. One other thing that I wanted to talk about that's related in just the next few minutes that we have is the idea of whether and how if we're going to expand, if we're going to give people the ability to take more cases, it seems to me that that has to be done on an individual lawyer basis rather than an entity basis. Or you do create this expectation within the entity, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. If other people have ideas, you could create an expectation, as Susan was talking about, within the entity for having to take cases, or judges or DAs having the expectation that you have to take these cases. And maybe the entity itself has expectations. And I'm thinking of consortia right now. We want to talk about nonprofits separately. But I want your thoughts about whether you think this should be hey, I have a contract with a consortia and I'm also willing to take more cases, so I'll enter into my own separate contract, or whether we think that should be done by entity. Tom?
Did you say Tom?
I did.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear. So I think that's a really smart way to proceed. But if a consortium consists only of lawyers, all of whom meet the requirements, I wouldn't be concerned. I guess on the other hand, there may be some value in allowing some flexibility so that a person who's abruptly free because of a settlement could, work some extra cases. But I think that's outweighed by the risk that people who are underqualified or too new in their careers would be deluged by the new cases. So I'd do a lawyer by lawyer review. That's a good idea.
Right. Rob, what do you think about that? About just the logistics, having run a consortium?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, you could say, well, I got 10 lawyers, 6 of them have opted into this program. Therefore, I want, say, 15%. Would that be 695, a 0.95 MAC to divide? And as the manager, I will administer it. You'll pay me and I'll administer the money. I guess that would be okay. Alternatively, I do like the idea actually is saying, like, maybe doing a contract where it says I'm qualified. I'm a member of this consortia, but I'm going to do a supplemental contract for whatever it is. Is that doable though, Ken? Is that a complicated thing, or what do you think?
I think doable and complicated are two different questions. I think doable, yes, but I'll need to talk with staff about complexity. I think that one thing I've been thinking about a lot internally myself, but I'm not sure how to solve it by any means because I'm just getting to the tip of the iceberg, is that the number of amendments that staff have been processing has just been increasing exponentially. And so perhaps there's a trade-off if we could find a more flexible contracting model on the front end that results in fewer amendments, then maybe the offset of having individual contracts for the overages, maybe it would all be a wash. But I think that's something we need to talk about internally. But those are the types of things I'm at least trying to think through, like whether we can do something that has a net zero or a low impact on staff, because I know they're stretched pretty thin. But I do like where the discussion is going, and I think that either way, we could make something happen. But we'll have to talk the details.
Yeah, I know that I think in the current bill, are there some requirements for consortia to adopt over a period of time? I don't know.
Don't know.
We don't know what the current version.
New bill is coming out tomorrow,
Yeah.
probably, yeah. I will say that my suggestion about that to Senator Prozansky was that those be stripped out and that they be part of rulemaking. That the agency does that by OAR rather than by statute, because that gives flexibility, and it also gives flexibility for time too, to be able to incorporate that. Because if you passed a bill that said, oh, by July 1, everybody's gonna, there's an emergency, this is going to take effect. Or if you do it, let's say you do it by January, it's in the middle of a contract cycle. So what, we're gonna have to redo contracts in January? So I don't know what it's gonna look like, but I hope that that's OAR. So Ken brings up a really good point that if we do it by individual lawyer, then it's going to affect the nonprofits in that it will make them ineligible. But if you, oh, Susan, okay, Susan, just talk. Go for it.
I think what I was going to say before you raise the nonprofit, I think that the only way to do it, I think you have to treat the consortia and the nonprofits differently. And I think the only way you could do it, never having administered a nonprofit, it seems to me that the only way you could do it with nonprofits would be to give the nonprofits a supplemental contract for overages. The nonprofits could probably, and I'm sure that we'll hear from them if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me the nonprofit, whoever's the executive director of a nonprofit, would have some idea of which lawyers in the nonprofit meet the criteria that we set out, and could have a conversation with those lawyers about which ones might be willing to consider doing overages, because not all of them will want to. And once the director of the nonprofit has some sense of what the nonprofit's capacity might be to do the overages, that at that point the nonprofit could enter into some kind of supplemental contract to do overages if it becomes possible. So the contract would have to not be, you have to do this. The contract would have to be, if it turns out it's possible, here's how we're going to work it out, and here's how you're going to be compensated. And then it would be up to the director of the nonprofit to sort out how to deal with paying the lawyers who participate in that, whatever extra they would get paid. I don't see how you could do it on an individual lawyer basis with the nonprofits.
I agree, but the problem, I totally 100% agree. But the problem is, then you create that expectation with the court that nonprofit can be assigned more cases, and why aren't you taking more cases, and why, you know what I mean? So then you run back into that problem again.
Well, I don't know if you are, because first of all, it would depend on how the contract is worded. But second of all, I think the only way this would work, and I think that that's also true with the consortia, where you're doing it more on an individual basis. I think the only way this would work and not create that problem with the courts is if it's paired with having a county thing that you talked about before, having a county assignment coordinator. You have to take the assignment of counsel out of the hands of the judges.
Yeah.
It has to be an assignment coordinator. The judges and maybe it would be the Chief Justice who has to make sure this happens in the crisis counties at least. The judges have to defer to that one assignment coordinator for the county. And that assignment coordinator would have to understand that these contracts are not requirements.
Yeah,
right?
That's a good point.
And that's the only way it would work. I agree with you that if it was up to the judges, this wouldn't work. But I think that there's a way that the contracts can be worded and the coordination with an assignment coordinator can occur. That coordinator would have to work closely with the agency, with the commission agency. And then I think it would have a possibility of working. Anyway.
Paul. You're muted.
I'm still a rookie. I think this is all good and well while we work towards a solution that makes sense to us. But my experience, politically speaking, is that if we want buy-in from the judges and the prosecutors, we ought to send them a request for suggestions and let them have some degree of buy-in. And we might even get some good suggestions as to what we could do to make indigent defense more efficient and more cost realistic, and give that same exact same or maybe slightly different to the DAs to give their opinions back to us on what could be done to make the system less costly. We're going to have to sell whatever we do. We're going to have to sell it to these groups as well as the legislatures, or they're going to beat us up in the legislature. So let's invite them in early and ask for their suggestion. People generally like to be asked what they think about a problem before somebody else hands them a solution. That's just a suggestion based on my experience as a presiding judge, among other things.
I think judges would have a lot of ideas about system efficiencies, which might be very helpful. I hesitate to ask DAs about how they think it could be more cost effective or efficient. Although maybe they have some good ideas too, but my cynical side says that their ideas may not necessarily be helpful. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't ask.
I think we have more good DAs than bad DAs. And I think it just helps to ask, even if people don't respond, they at least have been asked, and they can't say, nobody asked me if this would work or not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Susan. You're muted.
There we go. I like that idea. I would also ask them, though, why do you think the system isn't working well?
Oh, I know the answer to that. You want the answer to that? The
I
answer
know
to
the answer to
lawyers
that
aren't
too.
taking enough cases.
Yeah, I know the answer to that too. But we would get, if we ask them, how do we solve this problem? We're going to get the same response from some of them, which is going to be, we solve this problem by lawyers taking more cases, right? So I would like to know what their view of the whole system is.
We have
As a way to weigh their suggestions for fixing it. I don't know if I can weigh their suggestions for fixing it unless I know what they think it is that we're fixing. So
I have a copy of the spreadsheet, or I know Lisa does, she can find it faster than I can, of the suggestions that the DAs, that ODAA gave us out of the governor's work group meeting about all of the things that they thought public defense needed to do to fix the problem and to make the system more efficient. So we actually have information from them, and it's very long. There's like 38 items or something on there.
maybe the question should be asked, because I agree with Paul that people buy into a solution more easily if they're asked for their advice. I've seen that. The administering I've done was at the law school, but I've definitely seen that doing that. So if the question were framed, assuming that at the moment, Oregon cannot hire enough lawyers to cover all of the cases in the system, what ways can you see to solve the system problem? So it's words along the, but cut out in the way the question is asked the possibility of the answer being lawyers should take more cases. There's a way to ask the question that would direct answers differently from that solution. And I think that's the way to ask the question.
Okay, Rob.
So to build on that a little bit, my experience, I guess, recently is that not all the DAs are on the same page on some of these issues, as I think Paul mentioned as well. So I think this is all a good idea. I would say that rather than, I mean, you can talk to Amanda Dalton for sure, but I would convene the crisis county DAs only. They're
They-
the ones that are under the most.
I think they were just the crisis county DAs.
Was it? Well, I know even the crisis county DAs, because remember the DAs came up with like a 6-point plan or something to solve the problem or whatever it was. And I know they debated amongst themselves about some of that stuff. And so I do think that there are some that are willing to talk more about systemic changes that they could contribute, particularly if we made them at least temporary. I think if we focus on this, the temporary, the shorter range problem, the unrepresented crisis, maybe it will take, I don't think it will take 4 years to knock it out, but it's going to take months and months. But it's going to depend largely on how effective we can make a system that allows us to process these cases effectively, ethically, and efficiently over a period of time. And we will need the DA's input, as you say, Paul, and the judge's input, as you say, and have them buy in and get some ownership, give them some ownership on this by inviting them in, but keep the tent as narrow as possible to only people directly adversely affected, which are the crisis county officials.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very helpful. I was slightly distracted because I was looking for that spreadsheet, but I can't find it, but I'll find it. But I'll tell you the one thing that the DAs did say that everybody agreed in the room, every single person in the entire room agreed. Mac needs to go away. Everyone. Paige Clarkson was the one who stood up and said, can we all agree that Mac is bad and it needs to go away? And there was consensus in the room that we all agreed. The only people who don't agree is the legislature because they can't fund it, which is, I mean, I won't make a comment about, I mean, it is what it is, right? But everyone agrees that Mac doesn't capture the workload. You know, counting how many cases are assigned has nothing to do. And we heard that very, very clearly, and we didn't really get to address it in Jackson County. We didn't circle back around. But remember, the presiding judge came in and he said, I don't understand when lawyers say they can't take more cases. I'm looking at how many cases right here have been assigned, and there's only been 50. The average caseload's only 58 cases or whatever number he came up with. And I thought at the time, but we got distracted. This is a perfect example of the difference between Mac and workload, because you're looking at how many cases have been assigned. You are not looking at a person's open caseload. And that has, how many cases have been assigned to a lawyer have nothing to do with what their open caseload is. So, but, all right. Unless there's anything else for the good of the order, I think what the plan is going forward is we'll put together, we'll fill in the framework. Oh, go ahead, Paul. You're muted.
Sorry, I'd like to get a copy of those surveys that you said you had, at least from the DAs, if not from judges. Um,
I'll find
see
it. It's a
See what kind
spreadsheet
of information we already
put
have.
together.
I don't know.
No, it is something that I don't believe was sent out to the general commission because it was generated as part of that work group and it was before you were on the commission. And Lisa knows what I'm talking about, and Lisa will get it, and we'll get it out to everybody. But the plan now is to fill in, to come up with a framework for the letter to the governor, and then the details of that, the policies and the program details, it's going to have to put together by trial support division or whoever Ken decides needs to put it together, to bring to, in whatever form we can, to bring to the commission to the May meeting, so that we can at a minimum agree on the bullet points. If we can't agree on how we're going to implement them, at least we'll agree on the bullet points. And I really appreciate everybody's time, and this has been a great discussion per usual. I love these meetings because we get so much done. Ken, before we leave, is there anything that you want us to talk about to give you direction that we haven't addressed? I realize we're right at 6:30, but I don't want to leave you if you don't know, if you have a question.
No, I have 5 pages of notes with really great thoughts and observations, and so I think this has been a really good discussion. And yes, I think as we work together to build that document that we can circulate before the commission, then we may have some more things we identify, but then that can be discussed at the meeting.
Great. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Thank you. See you in a week or so. All right. Bye.